He's been quiet in the last while, but there were times when his passionate affairs were the scandal of the city, or at least of the foreigners who live here. A jealous lover, a young Moroccan boy, chased him down the causeway with a sword one night. They were both stark naked. Quite a shocking event in Bombay, and in the case of Didier, something of a spectacle, I can report. He ran into the Colaba police station, and they rescued him. They are very conservative about such things in India, but Didier has one rule. He never has any sex involvement with Indians. And I think they respect that. A lot of foreigners come here just for the sex with very young Indian boys. Didier despises them, and he restricts himself to affairs with foreigners. I wouldn't be surprised if that's why he told you so much of other people's business tonight. He was trying to seduce you, perhaps, by impressing you with his knowledge of dark business and dark people. Oh, hello? Katsali? Hey, where did you come from? We'd come upon a cat that was squatting on the sea wall to eat from a parcel someone had discarded there. The thin grey animal hunkered down and scowled, growling and whining at the same time. But it allowed Carla to stroke its back as it lowered its head to the food once more. It was a wizened and scabrous specimen, with one ear chewed to the shape of a rosebud, and bare patches on its sides and back where unhealed sores were exposed. I found it amazing that such a feral, emaciated creature should permit itself to be petted by a stranger, and that Carla would want to do such a thing. Even more astounding, it seemed to me then, was that the cat had such a keen appetite for vegetables and rice, cooked in a sauce of whole, very hot chilies. "Oh, look at him," she cooed. "Isn't he beautiful?" Well, don't you admire his courage, his determination to survive? I'm afraid I don't like cats very much. I don't mind dogs, but cats... But you must love cats. In a perfect world, all the people would be like cats are, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I laughed. Did anyone ever tell you you've got a very peculiar way of putting things? What do you mean? She asked, turning to me quickly. Even in the streetlight, I could see that her face was flushed, almost angry. I didn't know then that the English language was a gentle obsession with her, that she studied and wrote and worked hard to compose those clever fragments of her conversation. Just that you have a unique way of expressing yourself. Don't get me wrong. I like it. I like it very much. It's like... Well, take yesterday, for instance. When we were all talking about truth, capital T, truth, absolute truth, ultimate truth, and is there any truth, is anything true? Everybody had something to say about it. Didier, Ulla, Maurizio, even Medina. Then you said, the truth is a bully we all pretend to like. I was knocked out by it. Did you read that in a book, or hear it in a play, or a movie? No, I made it up myself. Well, that's what I mean. I don't think I could repeat anything that the others said, and be sure of getting it exactly right, but that line of yours, I'll never forget it. Do you agree with it? What, that the truth is a bully we all pretend to like? Yes. No, I don't. Not at all. But I love the idea, and the way you put it. Her half-smile held my stare. We were silent for a few moments, and just as she began to look away, I spoke again to hold her attention. Why do you like Biarritz? What? The other day, the day before yesterday, you said that Biarritz is one of your favourite places. I've never been there, so I don't know one way or the other, but I'd like to know why you like it so much. She smiled, wrinkling her nose in a quizzical expression that might have been scornful or pleased. You remember that? Then I guess I better tell you. Biarritz, how to explain it? I think it's the ocean, the Atlantic. I love Biarritz in the wintertime, when the tourists are gone, and the sea is so frightening that it turns people to stone. You see them standing on the deserted beaches and staring at the sea, statues scattered along the beach between the cliffs, frozen stiff by the terror they feel when they look at the ocean. It's not like other oceans, not like the warm Pacific or the Indian. The Atlantic there, in winter, is really unforgiving and ruthlessly cruel. You can feel it calling to you. You know it wants to drag you out and pull you under. It's so beautiful. I just burst into tears the first time I really looked at it. And I wanted to go to it. I wanted to let myself go out and under the big, angry waves. It's the scariest thing. But the people in Biarritz, they're the most tolerant and easygoing people in Europe, I think. Nothing freaks them out. Nothing is too over the top. It's kind of weird. In most holiday places, the people are angry and the sea is calm. In Biarritz, it's the other way around. Do you think you'll go back there one day? To stay, I mean? No, she said quickly. If I ever leave here for good, it'll mean going back to the States. I grew up there after my parents died. And I'd like to go back someday. I think I love it there most of all. There's something so confident and open-hearted and brave about America and the American people. I don't feel American. At least I don't think I do. But I'm comfortable with them, if you know what I mean. More than I am with any other people, anywhere. Tell me about the others, I asked, wanting to keep her talking. The others? She asked, frowning suddenly. The crew at Leopold's, Didier and the others. Tell me about Letitia to start with. How do you know her? She relaxed and let her eyes roam the shadows on the far side of the street. Still thinking, still considering, she lifted her gaze to the night sky. The blue-white light from a street lamp melted to liquid on her lips and in the spheres of her large eyes. Letty lived in Goa for a while, she began, affection playing in her voice. She came to India for the usual mix, parties and spiritual highs. She found the parties, and she enjoyed them, I think. Letty loves a party. But she never had much luck with the spiritual side of things. She went back to London, twice in the same year. But then she came back to India for one last try at the soul thing. She's on a soul mission. She talks tough, but she's a very spiritual girl. I think she's the most spiritual of all of us, really. How does she live? I don't mean to pry. It's what I was saying before. I just want to learn how people make a living here. How foreigners get by, I mean. She's an expert with gems, gemstones and jewels. She works on a commission basis for some of the foreign buyers. It was Didier who got her the job. He has contacts everywhere in Bombay. Didier? I smiled, genuinely surprised. I thought that they hated each other. Well, not hate exactly. I thought they couldn't stand each other. Oh, they annoy one another, sure. But there's a real friendship there. If anything bad happened to one of them, the other would be devastated. How about Maurizio? I asked, trying to keep my tone even. The tall Italian was too handsome, too confident, and I envied him for what I saw as his deeper knowledge of Carla and his friendship with her. What's his story? His story? I don't know what his story is, she replied, frowning again. His parents died, leaving him a lot of money. He spent it, and I think he developed something of a talent for spending money. Other people's money? I asked. I might have seemed too eager for that to be true, because she answered me with a question. Do you know the story of the scorpion and the frog? You know, the frog agrees to carry the scorpion across the river, because the scorpion promises not to sting him. Yeah, and then the scorpion stings the frog halfway across the river. The drowning frog asks him why he did it when they'll both drown. And the scorpion says that he's a scorpion, and it's his nature to sting. Yes, she sighed, nodding slowly until the frown left her brow. That's Maurizio. And if you know that, he's not a problem, because you just don't offer to carry him across the river. You know what I mean? I'd been in prison. I knew exactly what she meant. I nodded and asked her about Ulla and Modena. I like Ulla, she answered quickly, turning that half-smile on me again. She's crazy and unreliable, but I have a feeling for her. She was a rich girl in Germany, and she played with heroin until she got a habit. Her family cut her off, so she came to India. She was with a bad guy, a German guy, a junkie like her, who put her to work in a very tough place, a horrible place. She loved the guy. She did it for him. She would have done anything for him. Some women are like that. Some loves are like that. Most loves are like that from what I can see. Your heart starts to feel like an overcrowded lifeboat. You throw your pride out to keep it afloat, and your self-respect and your independence. After a while you start throwing people out, your friends, everyone you used to know. And it's still not enough. The lifeboat is still sinking, and you know it's going to take you down with it. I've seen that happen to a lot of girls here. I think that's why I'm sick of love. I couldn't tell if she was talking about herself or pointing the words at me. Either way, they were sharp, and I didn't want to hear them. And how about Kavita? Where does she fit in? Kavita's great. She's a freelancer. You know that, a freelance writer. She wants to be a journalist, and I think she'll get there. I hope she gets there. She's bright and honest and gutsy. She's beautiful, too. Don't you think she's a gorgeous girl? Sure, I agreed, recalling the honey-colored eyes, the full and shapely lips, and the long, expressive fingers. She's a pretty girl, but they're all good-looking people, I think. Even Didier, in his crumpled-up way, has got a touch of the Lord Byron about him. Letty's a lovely girl. Her eyes are always laughing. They're real ice blue, her eyes, aren't they? Ulla looks like a doll, with those big eyes and big lips on such a round face. But it's a pretty doll's face. Maurizio's handsome, like a magazine model. And Modena's handsome in a different way, like a bullfighter or something. And you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen with my own eyes. There, I'd said it. And even in the shock of speaking the thought out loud, I wondered if she'd understood, if she'd pierced my words about their beauty and hers, to find the misery that inspired them, the misery that an ugly man feels in every conscious minute of love. She laughed, a good, deep, wide-mouthed laugh, and seized my arm impulsively, pulling me along the footpath. Just then, as if drawn from the shadows by her laughter, there was a clattering rattle of noise as a beggar, riding on a small wooden platform with metal ball-bearing wheels, rolled off the footpath on the opposite side of the street. He pushed himself forward with his hands until he reached the centre of the deserted road, wheeling to a stop with a dramatic pirouette. His piteously thin mantis legs were folded and tucked beneath him on the platform, which was a piece of wood no bigger than a folded newspaper. He wore a boy's school uniform of khaki shorts and a powder blue shirt. Although he was a man in his 20s, the clothes were too big for him. Carla called out, greeting him by name, and we stopped opposite him. They spoke for some time in Hindi. I stared across the 10 meters that separated us, fascinated by the man's hands. They were huge hands, as wide across the back, from knuckle to knuckle, as his face. In the streetlight, I could see that they were thickly padded on the fingers and palms, like the paws of a bear. "Good night," he called out in English after a minute. He lifted one hand, first to his forehead and then to his heart, in a delicate gesture of consummate gallantry. With another swift, show-off's pirouette, he propelled himself forward along the road, gaining speed as he rolled down the gentle slope to the Gateway Monument. We watched him out of sight, and then Carla pulled at my arm, leading me along the path once more. I allowed myself to be led, I allowed myself to be drawn by the soft pleading of the waves and the roulade of her voice, by the black sky and the darker night of her hair, by the sea-tree stone smell of the sleeping street, and the perfume sublime on her warm skin. I allowed myself to be drawn into her life, and the life of the city. I walked her home. I said good night, and I was singing quietly to myself as I went back along the silent brood of streets to my hotel. Chapter 3. What you're saying is that we're finally going to get down to the real deal. Real will be full, Baba, Prabhakar assured me. And deal will be plenty also. Now you will see it, the really city. Usually I am never taking the tourists to these places. They are not liking it, and I am not liking they are not liking. Or maybe sometimes they are liking it too much in these places, and I am liking that even less, isn't it? You must have it a good heads to like these things, and you must be having a good hearts to not like them too much. Like you, Lin Baba. You are my good friend. I knew it very well on that first day, when we were drinking the whiskey in your room. Now, my Bombay, with your good heads and your good hearts, you will see it all. We were riding in a taxi along Mahatma Gandhi Road, past Flora Fountain and towards Victoria Station. It was an hour before noon, and the swash of traffic that coursed through that stone canyon was swollen by large numbers of runners pushing tiffin carts. The runners collected lunches from homes and apartments and placed them in tin cylinders called jalpans, or tiffins. They pushed huge trays of the tiffins on long wooden carts, 6 men and more to a cart. Through the heavy metal traffic of buses, trucks, scooters and cars, they made deliveries at offices and businesses all over the city. None but the men and women who operated the service knew exactly how it was done. How barely literate men evolved the bafflingly complex system of symbols, colours and key numbers to mark and identify the cylinders. How, day after day, hundreds of thousands of those identical containers swept through the city on their wooden axles, oiled with sweat, and reached the right man or woman, among millions, every time, and how all that was achieved at a cost measured in cents rather than dollars. Magic, the trick that connects the ordinary to the impossible, was the invisible river that ran through every street and beating heart in Bombay in those years, and nothing, from the postal service to the pleading of beggars, worked without a measure of it. What number that bus, Lin Baba? Quickly tell it. Just a second. I hesitated, peering out of the half-open window of the taxi and trying to read the curlicue numbers on the front of a red double-decker bus that had stopped opposite us momentarily. It's a 104, isn't it? Very, very fine. You have learned your Hindi numbers so nicely. Now, no problem for you. Reading numbers for bus and train and menu card and drugs purchase and other good things. Now, tell me, what is aloo palak? Aloo palak is potato and spinach. Good. And nice eating also, you have not mentioned. I love to eat it, aloo palak. What is full gobi and pindi? That's, cauliflower and okra. Correct. And also good eating, again you are not mentioned. What is baigan masala? That's, spiced eggplant. Again right. What is it, you're not enjoying eating baigan? Yes, all right, baigan is good eating too. I don't like it baigan so much, he sneered, wrinkling up his short nose. Tell me, what am I calling chera, mung, and dil? Okay, don't tell me. Face, mouth, and heart, is that right? Very right, no problem. I've been watching it how nicely you eat up your foods with the hand, like a good Indian style. And how you learn to ask for the things. How much this, how much that? Give me 2 cups of tea, I want more hashish. Speaking only Hindi to the people. I have seen this all. You are my best student, Lin Baba. And I am your best teacher also, isn't it? It is, Prabhu, I laughed. Hey, watch out! My shout alerted the taxi driver, who swerved just in time to avoid an ox cart that was attempting to make a turn in front of us. The taxi driver, a burly, dark-skinned man with a bristling moustache, seemed to be outraged at my impertinence in saving our lives. When we first took the taxi, he'd adjusted his mirror until he saw nothing in it but my face. After the near miss, he glared at me, snarling a growl of insults in Hindi. He drove the cab like a getaway car, slewing left and right to overtake slower vehicles. There was an angry, bullying pugnacity in his attitude to everyone else on the road. He rushed to within centimetres of every slower car in his path, sounding his horn, then all but nudging it out of the way. If the slower car moved a little to the left in order to let him pass, our driver drew beside it, pacing it for a time and shouting insults. When he spied another slow vehicle ahead, he sped forward to repeat the procedure. From time to time, he opened his door and leaned out over the road to spit pan juice, taking his eyes off the traffic ahead for long seconds as we hurtled along in the rattling cab. "This guy's a nutcase," I muttered to Prabhakar. "Driving is not so good," Prabhakar replied, bracing himself with both arms against the back of the driver's seat. "But I have to say, the spitting and insulting is a first-class job." "For Christ's sake, tell him to stop!" I shouted, as the cab accelerated into a squall of traffic, lurching in the swerve left and right. "He's going to kill us!" "Band karo!" Prabhakar shouted. "Stop!" He added a pithy curse for good measure, but the driver only became more enraged. With the car hurtling along at top speed, he turned his head to snarl at us. His mouth was wide open and his teeth were bared. His eyes were huge, their blackness streaked with rage. "Hurry!" Prabhakar shrieked, pointing past the driver. It was too late. The man turned quickly. His arms stiffened at the wheel and he hit the brakes hard. There was a skating, sliding second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I heard a guttural gasp of air from deep in his throat. It was a sucking sound like the lifting of a flat stone from the moist clay on the edge of a riverbed. Then there was the whump and crash as we slammed into a car that had stopped in front of us to make a turn. We were thrown forward into the back of his seat and heard 2 thumping explosions as 2 other cars rammed into us. Shattered glass and chrome fragments rattled on the road like thin metallic applause in the sudden silence that followed the impacts. My head had hit the door in the tumble spill of the accident. I felt blood flowing from a cut above my eye, but I was otherwise unhurt. As I wriggled myself up from the floor and onto the back seat once more, I felt Prabhakar's hands on me. "Nothing broken, you are, Lin. You are okay." I'm okay. "You are sure? Everything not broken?" "Jesus, Prabhu, I don't care how good this guy's spitting is," I said, laughing nervously and ragged with relief. "He doesn't get a tip. Are you all right?" "They must get out, Lin," he answered, his voice rising to a hysterical whine. "Out! Out of here! Now!" The door on his side was jammed shut, and he began to push at it with his shoulder. He couldn't budge it. He reached across me to try the door on my side, but saw at once that another car was jammed against it, pinning it shut. Our eyes met, and there was such fear in him, such terror in the white-rimmed bulge of his eyes, that I felt the coldness of it deep in my chest. He turned at once and threw himself again at the door on his side. My mind was muddy water, and one idea splashed up from it, clear and exclusive. Fire. Is that what he's afraid of? Once I'd asked myself the question, I couldn't stop thinking it. I looked at the terror that pulled at Prabhakar's gasping mouth, and I was sure the taxi was going to catch fire. I knew we were trapped there. The rear windows in all the Bombay taxis I'd seen didn't open beyond a few centimetres. The doors were jammed, and the windows wouldn't open, and the taxi was going to explode in fire, and we were trapped. Burned alive. Is that why he's so scared? I looked to the driver. He was slumped awkwardly between the steering wheel and the door. His body was still, but I heard him moaning. Beneath the thin shirt, the abacus ridge of his spine rose and fell with each slow and shallow breath. Faces appeared at the windows of the cab, and I heard excited voices. Prabhakar looked out at them, turning this way and that, his face cramped in an expression of terrible anguish. Suddenly he clambered over the seat into the front of the car and wrestled the passenger door open. Turning swiftly and grabbing at my arms with surprising strength, he tried to drag me by main force over the seat that divided us. Desweilen! Get out now! Hurry! Hurry! I climbed up and over the seat. Prabaker got out of the car, pushing his way into a crowd of onlookers. I reached out to the driver, trying to prise him from the obstructing rim of the steering wheel. But Prabaker's hands were on me again, brutally rough. The fingernails of one hand tore into the skin of my back, and the other wrenched at the collar of my shirt. "Don't touch him, Lynn!" he almost screamed. "Don't touch him! Leave him and get out! Get out now!" He dragged me from the car and through the hedge of bodies pressing in on the accident. On a footpath nearby, we sat beneath a fringe of hawthorn leaves that overhung a fence of wrought-iron spears and inspected one another for injuries. The cut on my forehead, above my right eye, wasn't as serious as I'd thought. The bleeding had already stopped, and it began to weep a clear, plasmic fluid. I was sore in a few places, but it was no cause for concern. Prabaker cradled his arm, the same arm that had pulled me from the car with such irresistible power, and it was obvious that he was in pain. A large swelling had already formed near the elbow. I knew it would leave a nasty bruise, but nothing seemed to be broken. "Looks like you were wrong, Prabhu," I chided, smiling as I lit a cigarette for him. "Wrong, Baba? Getting us out of the car in such a panic and all. You really had me going. I thought the damn thing was going to catch fire, but it looks okay." "Oh," he replied softly, staring straight ahead. "You think I was frightened for fire? Not fire in the car, Lynn, but fire in the people. Look now. See the public, how they are." We stood, stretching the ache from shoulders and whiplashed necks, and looked toward the wreckage some 10 meters away. About 30 people had gathered around the 4 crashed vehicles. A few of them were helping drivers and passengers from the damaged cars. The rest huddled together in groups, gesturing wildly and shouting. More people streamed towards the site from every direction. Drivers of other cars that had been blocked from travelling further left their vehicles and joined the crowd. The 30 people became 50, 80, then 100 as we watched. One man was the centre of attention. It was his car that had been trying to turn right, his car we'd smashed into with the brakes on full lock. He stood beside the taxi, bellowing with rage. He was a round-shouldered man, in his middle 40s, wearing a grey cotton safari suit that had been tailored to accommodate the extravagant boast of his large paunch. His thinning hair was awry, the breast pocket of his suit had been torn, there was a rip in his trousers, and he'd lost one sandal. That dishevelment combined with his theatrical gestures and persistent shouting to present a spectacle that seemed to be more enthralling, for the crowd of onlookers, than the wreckage of the cars. His hand had been cut from the palm to the wrist. As the staring crowd grew more silent, subdued by the drama, he smeared blood from the wound on his face and beat the redness into the grey of his suit, shouting all the while. Just then, some men carried a woman into the little clear space around the man and placed her on a piece of cloth that was stretched out on the ground for her. They shouted instructions to the crowd, and in moments a wooden cart appeared, pushed by bare-chested men wearing only singlets and short lungis. The woman was lifted onto the cart, her red sari gathered up in folds and wrapped about her legs. She may have been the man's wife, I couldn't be sure, but his rage suddenly grew hysterical. He seized her roughly by the shoulders and shook her. He pulled at her hair. He appealed to the crowd with enormous, histrionic gestures, flinging his arms wide and then striking his own blood-streaked face. They were the gestures of pantomime, the exaggerated simulations of silent films, and I couldn't help thinking they were absurd and funny. But the injuries people had sustained were real, as were the rumbling threats that surged through the ever-increasing crowd. As the semi-conscious woman was trundled away on the humble cart, the man hurled himself at the door of the taxi, wrenching it open. The crowd reacted as one. They dragged the dazed and injured taxi driver from his cab in an instant and flung him on the bonnet of the car. He raised his arms in feeble pleading, but a dozen, 20, 50 hands punched and tore at him. Blows drummed on his face, chest, stomach, and groin. Fingernails scratched and ripped, tearing his mouth open on one side almost to the ear, and shredding his shirt to rags. It happened in seconds. I told myself, as I watched the beating, that it was all too fast, that I was dazed, that there was no time to react. What we call cowardice is often just another name for being taken by surprise, and courage is seldom any better than simply being well prepared. And I might have done more. I might have done something, anything, if it had happened in Australia. It's not your country, I told myself, as I watched the beating. It's not your culture. But there was another thought, dark and secret then, and all too clear to me now. The man was an idiot, an insulting and belligerent idiot, whose reckless stupidity had risked Prabhaka's life and mine. A splinter of spite had pierced my heart when the crowd turned on him, and at least some small particle of their revenge, a blow or a shout or a shove, was my own. Helpless, craven, ashamed, I did nothing. "We've got to do something," I said lamely. "Enough people are doing, Baba," Prabhaka replied. "No, I mean, we've got to... Can't we help him somehow?" "For this fellow is no helping," he sighed. "Now you see it, Lynn. Accidents is very bad business in Bombay. Better you get out of that car or taxi or what is it you are in very, very quickly. The public are not having patience for such business. See now, it is too late for that fellow." The beating was swift but savage. Blood streamed from many cuts on the man's face and naked torso. At a signal, perceived somehow through the howl and shriek of the crowd, the man was lifted up and carried off at head height. His legs were pressed together and stretched out, held rigid by a dozen hands. His arms were splayed out at right angles to his body and held fast. His head lolled and fell back, the soft wet flap of skin hanging from cheek to jaw. His eyes were open, conscious, staring backward and upside down. Black eyes scudded with fear and imbecile hope. Traffic on the far side of the road parted to let the people pass, and the man slowly disappeared, crucified on the hands and shoulders of the crowd. "Come on, Lynn. Let's go. You okay?" "I'm all right," I mumbled, forcing myself to shuffle into step beside him. My self-assurance had melted through muscle and bone to settle in my knees. Each step was leaden and willed. It wasn't the violence that had shaken me. I'd seen worse, and with far less provocation in prison. It was instead the too sudden collapse of my stilted complacencies. The weeks of the city I'd thought I was beginning to know. The Bombay of temples, bazaars, restaurants, and new friends had cindered in the fires of that public rage. What are they going to do with him? "They will take him to police. I think so. Behind Crawford Market is one police station for this area. Maybe he will have the luck. Maybe alive he will reach there. Maybe not. He has a very quickly karma, this fellow." "You seen this before?" "Oh, many times, Lin Baba. Sometimes I drive it, my cousin Shantu's taxi. I have seen so many angry publics. That is why I was getting so afraid for you, and for my good self also." "Why does it happen like that? Why do they get so crazy about it?" "That is nobody knows, Lin," Prabhaka shrugged, quickening his pace a little. "Wait a minute." I paused, slowing him with a hand to his shoulder. "Where are we going?" "Still going for the tour, isn't it?" "I thought maybe you want to call it off for today." "Calling off? Why? We have it a real and full deal to see, Lin Baba. So let's go, nah?" "But what about your arm? Don't you want to get it seen too?" "No problem this arms, Lin. For last of the touring, we will have some whiskey drinks in a terrible place I know. That will be a good medicine. So come on, let's go now, Baba. Well, okay, if you say so. But we were going the other way, weren't we? Still going the other way, Baba, Prabhakar replied with some urgency. But first going this way only. Over there is a telephone at the station. I must call my cousin, working now at Sunshine Restaurant as the dishes washing boy. He is wanting a taxi driving job for his brother, Suresh, and I must give it the number and boss name of the driver, now gone with the people. That fellow's boss will be needing a new driver now, and we must hurry for such a good chance, isn't it? Prabhakar made that call. Seconds later, he continued his tour of the dark side of the city without a heartbeat of hesitation, in another taxi, as if nothing had happened. Nor did he ever raise the matter with me again. When I occasionally spoke of it, he responded with a shrug, or some bland comment about our good luck in avoiding serious injury. For him, the incident was like a brawl in a nightclub, or a clash of rival supporters at a football match. Commonplace and unremarkable, unless you happened to be in the centre of it. But for me, that sudden, savage, bewildering riot, the sight of that taxi driver floating away on a rippling wave of hands, shoulders and heads, was a turning point. A new understanding emerged from it. I suddenly realized that if I wanted to stay there, in Bombay, the city I'd already fallen in love with, I had to change. I had to get involved. The city wouldn't let me be a watcher, aloof and apart. If I wanted to stay, I had to expect that she would drag me into the river of her rapture and her rage. Sooner or later, I knew, I would have to step off the pavement and into the bloody crowd, and put my body on the line. And with the seed of that resolve, born in that convulsion and portent, Prabhakar's dark circuit of the city began. When we resumed our tour, he took me to a slave market, not far from Dongri, an inner suburb famous for its mosques, bazaars and restaurants, specializing in Mughlai dishes. The main road became streets, and the streets became lanes, and when those proved too narrow for the taxi to negotiate, we left the vehicle and walked together in the sinuous busyness of the crowds. The further we travelled into the Cataline lanes, the more we lost of the day, the year, the very age in which we lived. As automobiles and then scooters disappeared, the air became clearer, sharper, with the sense of spices and perfumes undulled by the diesel and petrol fumes prevalent elsewhere. Traffic noise faded, ceased, and was replaced by street sound. A class of children reciting verses from the Koran in a little courtyard. The whir and scrape of stone on stone as women ground spices in doorways, and the whining optimism of cries from knife sharpeners, mattress fluffers, stove repairers, and other hawkers. They were people sounds, everywhere, played with voice and hand. At one turn in the puzzle alleyways, we passed a long metal rack where bicycles were parked. From then on, even those simple machines vanished. Goods were transported by bearers with enormous bundles on their heads. One burden usually carried by all, the thudding pressure of the Bombay sun, was lifted from us. The lanes were dark, cool, shadowless. Although only 3 and at most 4 stories tall, the buildings leaned in upon the winding pathways, and the sky was reduced to a thin brushstroke of pale blue. The buildings themselves were ancient and dilapidated. Stone facades, which had once been splendid and impressive, were crumbling, grimed, and patched with haphazard necessity. Here and there, small balconies jutted out to meet one another overhead, so close that neighbours could reach across and pass things with an outstretched hand. Glimpses inside the houses showed unpainted walls and sagging staircases. Many ground-floor windows were held open to reveal makeshift shops for the sale of sweets, cigarettes, groceries, vegetables, and utensils. It was clear that the plumbing was rudimentary, where it was connected at all. We passed several places where women gathered with metal or clay pots to collect water from a single outside tap. And skeined over all the buildings, like metal cobwebs, were complicated traceries of electrical conduits and wires. as if even that symbol and source of the modern age and its power was no more than a fragile, temporary net that might be swept away by a rough gesture. Just as the contracted lanes seemed with every twist and turn to belong to another age, so too did the appearance of the people change as we moved deeper into the maze. I saw less and less of the Western-style cotton shirts and trousers so common everywhere else in the city, until finally those fashions disappeared from all but the youngest children. Instead, the men wore traditional garments of colourful diversity. There were long silk shirts that descended to the knee and were fastened with pearl buttons from neck to waist, caftan robes in plain colours or stripes, hooded cloaks that resembled the garb of monks, and an endless variety of skull caps in white or beaded colours, and turbans in yellow, red, and electric blue. The women were more conspicuously bejewelled, despite the indigence of the quarter, and what those jewels lacked in money's worth was found in the extravagance of their design. No less prominent were caste-mark tattoos on some foreheads, cheeks, hands, and wrists, and every bare feminine foot was graced by anklets of silver bells and coiled brass toe rings. It was as if all of those hundreds of people were costumed for home, for themselves, not for the public promenades. It was as if they were safe there, to clothe themselves in tradition and display. And the streets were clean. The buildings were cracked and smeared. The constricted passageways were crowded with goats, chickens, dogs, and people, and each thin face showed the shade and hollows of penury. But the streets and the people were stainlessly, scrupulously clean. We turned then into more ancient alleyways, so narrow that two persons passed one another only with difficulty. People stepped into doorways, waiting for us to walk past before they moved on. The passages had been covered with false ceilings and stretched awnings, and in the darkness it wasn't possible to see more than a few meters in front or behind. I kept my eyes on Prabaker, fearful that I wouldn't find my way out alone. The little guide turned often, drawing my attention to a loose stone in the path ahead, or a step, or some obstruction overhead. Concentrating on those perils, I lost my orientation. My mental map of the city turned, blurred, faded, and I couldn't guess at the direction of the sea, or the major landmarks, Flora Fountain, BT Station, Crawford Market, we'd passed on our way to the quarter. I felt myself to be so deep in the flow and reflux of those narrow lanes, so smothered by the intimacy of open doors and perfumed bodies, that it seemed I was walking inside the buildings, inside the very homes, rather than between them. We came upon a stall where a man in a sweat-stained cotton vest stirred battered foods frying in a dish of bubbling oil. The blue flames of his kerosene stove, eerie and claustral, provided the only light. Emotion haunted his face. It was anguish, some kind of anguish, and the dull, stoic anger that hangs in the eyes of repetitive, ill-paid work. Prabaker moved past him and into the darkness beyond. As I approached the man, he turned to face me, and his eyes met mine. For a moment, the full force of his blue-lit anger was directed at me. Long years after that day, the Afghan guerrillas I came to know as friends, on a mountain near the siege of Kandahar, talked for hours about Indian films and their favourite Bollywood movie stars. "Indian actors are the greatest in the world," one of them said once, "because Indian people know how to shout with their eyes." That backstreet fried foods cook stared at me with shouting eyes and stopped me as surely as if he'd pushed a hand into my chest. I couldn't move. In my own eyes there were words. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you have to do this work. I'm sorry that your world, your life, is so hot and dark and unremembered. I'm sorry that I'm intruding." Still staring at me, he grasped the handles of his dish. For 1, 2 thudding heartbeats, I was gripped by the ridiculous, terrifying thought that he was going to throw the boiling oil in my face. Fear jerked at my feet, and I moved, easing my way past him with my hands flat against the damp surface of the stone wall. 2 steps beyond him, my foot struck a crack in the path, and I stumbled and fell, dragging another man down with me. He was an elderly man, thin and frail. I could feel the wicker basket of his bones through his coarse tunic. We fell heavily, landing near the open entrance to a house, and the old man struck his head. I scrambled to my feet, slipping and sliding on a pile of shifting stones. I tried to help the man to stand, but there was an elderly woman who squatted on her haunches there, in the open doorway, and she slapped at my hands, warning me away. I apologized in English, struggling to find the words for "I'm sorry" in Hindi. What are they? Prabhakar taught me the words. Mujhe ko afsos hai. That's it. I said it 3-4 times. In that dark, quiet corridor between the buildings, the words echoed like a drunkard's prayer in an empty church. The old man moaned quietly, slouching in the doorway. The woman wiped his face with a corner of her headscarf and held the cloth out for me to see the bright stain of blood. She said nothing, but her wrinkled face was creased with a frown of contempt. With that simple gesture, holding out the blood-stained cloth, she seemed to be saying, "Look, you stupid oaf, you great clumsy barbarian. Look what you've done here." I felt choked by the heat, smothered by the darkness and the strangeness of the place. The walls seemed to press upon my hands, as if only my arms prevented them from closing in on me altogether. I backed away from the elderly couple, stumbling at first, and then plunging headlong into the shadowland of the tunnel street. A hand reached out to grab at my shoulder. It was a gentle touch, but I almost shouted out loud. "This way, Baba," Prabhakar said, laughing quietly. "Where are you taking yourself? This way only. Along this passage now, and you must be keeping your 2 feet to the outside, because too much dirty it is in the middle of the passages, okay?" He was standing in the entrance to a narrow gap formed between the blank walls of 2 buildings. Feeble light gleamed in the teeth and eyes of his smile, but beyond him was only blackness. He turned his back to me, spread his feet out until they touched the walls, braced himself with his hands, and then shuffled off, sliding his feet along the walls in small, dragging steps. He expected me to follow. I hesitated, but when the awkward star of his shuffling form melted in the darkness and vanished, I too put my feet out against the walls and shambled after him. I could hear Prabhakar ahead of me, but it was so dark that I couldn't see him. One foot strayed from the edge of the wall, and my boot squelched into a muddy slime that rested in the centre of the path. A foul smell rose up from that viscous ooze, and I kept my feet hard against the walls, sliding them along in short steps. Something squat and heavy slithered past me, rasping its thick body against my boot. Seconds later, another and then a third creature waddled past me in the darkness, rolling heavy flesh over the toes of my boots. "Prabhu!" I bellowed, not knowing how far ahead of me he was. "There are things in here with us!" "Things, Baba?" "On the ground! Something's crawling on my feet! Something heavy!" "Only rats are crawling here, Lin. There are no things." "Rats? Are you kidding? These things are as big as bull terriers. Jesus, this is some tour, my friend." "No problem, big rats, Lin," Prabhakar answered quietly from the darkness in front of me. "Big rats are friendly fellows, not making mischief for the people, if you don't attack them. Only one thing is making them bite and scratch and such things." "What's that, for God's sake?" "Shouting, Baba," he replied softly. "They don't like the loud voices." "Oh, great. Now you tell me," I croaked. "Is it much further? This is starting to give me the creeps," and he'd stopped, and I bumped into him, pressing him against the panelled surface of a wooden door. "Yeah, here," he whispered, reaching out to knock with a complex series of taps and pauses. There was a scrape and clunk as a heavy bolt slid free, And then the door swung open, dazzling us with sudden bright light. Prabhakar grasped my sleeve and dragged me with him. "Quickly, Lin! No big rats allowed inside!" We stepped inside a small chamber, hemmed in by blank walls and lit from high above by a raw silk rectangle of sky. I could hear voices from deeper within the cul-de-sac. A huge man slammed the gate shut. He put his back to it and faced us with a scowl, teeth bared. Prabhakar began to talk at once, placating him with soft words and fawning gestures. The man shook his head repeatedly, interjecting regularly to say, "No, no, no." He towered over me. I was standing so close to him that I could feel the breath from his wide nostrils, the sound of it like wind whistling through caves on a rocky shore. His hair was very short, exposing ears as large and nubbled as a boxer's practice mitts. His square face seemed to be animated by more strong muscle tissue than the average man has in his back. His chest, as wide as I was from shoulder to shoulder, rose and fell with each breath, and rested upon an immense belly. The fine dagger line of his moustache accentuated his scowl, and he looked at me with such undiluted loathing that a little prayer unfurled itself in my mind. Please God, don't make me fight this man. He raised the palms of his hands to stop Prabhakar's wheedling cajolery. They were huge hands, gnarled and calloused enough to scrape the barnacles off the side of a dry-docked oil tanker. "He says we are not allowed inside," Prabhakar explained. "Well," I replied, reaching past the man and attempting with unforced enthusiasm to open the door, "you can't say we didn't try." "No, no, Lin!" Prabhakar stopped me. "We must argue with him about this matter." The big man folded his arms, stretching the seams of his khaki shirt with little ripples of sound. "I don't think that's such a good idea," I mumbled, under a tight smile. "Certainly it is," Prabhakar insisted. "Tourists are not allowed here, or to any of the other people markets. But I have told him that you are not one of these tourist fellows. I have told him that you have learned the Marathi language. He does not believe me. That is our problem only. He doesn't believe any foreigner will speak Marathi. You must, for that reason, speak it a little Marathi for him. You will see. He will allow us inside."